400 ships, 200,000 men, 180,000 square miles of ocean turned into a battlefield. In one single, chaotic, blood-soaked stretch of water in the Philippines, the greatest naval battle in the history of the human race unfolded over 4 days, and by the time the guns fell silent, the once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy would never again sail out to challenge the world. This is the story of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the battle where battleships fired point-blank at each other for the last time in human history, where a handful of American escort carriers and destroyers stood against the most powerful battle fleet in the Pacific and refused to run, and where, for the first time, Japanese pilots deliberately flew their planes into American ships, opening the terrifying age of the kamikaze. If you think you know naval warfare, you do not know this battle. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is almost too incredible to believe, and yet every word of it is true. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had reached its final desperate stage for the Empire of Japan. 2 years earlier, at Midway, Japan had lost 4 of its finest aircraft carriers in a single afternoon, a wound from which its naval air power never recovered. Since then, the United States had ground its way across the Pacific, island by island, in a relentless campaign of amphibious assault, carrier strikes, and submarine warfare that had strangled Japan's supply lines and shattered its once feared fleet air arm. Japan's veteran pilots, the men who had swept aside every enemy in 1941 and 1940, were dead. Their replacements were rushed through abbreviated training, thrown into combat with a fraction of the flying hours of the men they replaced. Japan's oil reserves, the lifeblood of any modern navy, were drying up, cut off by American submarines sinking tanker after tanker in the waters between Japan and the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. And now, in October of 1944, General Douglas MacArthur was preparing to make good on a promise he had made 2.5 years earlier when he had been forced to abandon the Philippines in the face of the Japanese invasion. Standing on the deck of a ship, staring at the islands he had been forced to flee, MacArthur had spoken 3 words that would become legend: "I shall return." For Japan, the loss of the Philippines was not simply a military setback, it was an existential threat. The island sat directly across the sea lanes connecting the Japanese home islands to the oil fields of Borneo and the resource-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies. If the Philippines fell into American hands, the Imperial Navy's battleships and cruisers, starved of fuel, would be cut off from the oil that kept them moving. Japan's high command understood with brutal clarity that if they did not stop MacArthur here, in the Philippines the war was effectively lost. And so Japan's naval planners conceived one of the most audacious and desperate plans of the entire war. A plan so complex, so reliant on perfect timing and total deception, that it would either deliver a stunning victory or destroy what remained of the Imperial Navy in a single stroke. It was called Shogo, meaning victory operation, and it called for not one fleet, but 4 separate Japanese naval forces, converging from different directions, to combine and annihilate the American invasion fleet gathered in Leyte Gulf. The plan hinged on deception. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would sail south from Japan with what remained of the Imperial Navy's once feared aircraft carriers, but by this point in the war, those carriers carried almost no planes and almost no trained pilots. Ozawa's force was, in truth, bait. Its entire purpose was to be discovered by the Americans and to lure away the most powerful fleet ever assembled in human history, the U.S. Third Fleet under the aggressive, hard-charging Admiral William Halsey. If Halsey could be tempted north, away from the vulnerable landing beaches at Leyte, then the real striking power of the Japanese Navy could slip through undetected. That striking power came in 2 forms. The first was the Center Force, commanded by Admiral Takeo Kurita, built around the two largest and most powerful battleships ever constructed by any nation on Earth, the Yamato and the Musashi, each displacing over 70,000 tons and armed with 18-inch guns capable of firing shells the size of small cars over 25 miles. Kurita's force would sail from Brunei, thread its way through the San Bernardino Strait, and fall upon the American landing forces from the north. Meanwhile, a smaller southern force under Admiral Shoji Nishimura, along with a trailing force under Admiral Kiyohide Shima, would approach from the south through the Surigao Strait, catching the Americans in a pincer between two battle fleets while their attention was fixed on the burning decoy carriers to the north. On paper, it was brilliant. In execution, it would become one of the most catastrophic gambles in naval history. The battle that followed is really 4 separate battles fought across 4 days and hundreds of miles of ocean. And to understand it, you need to understand each piece, because together they form the largest, strangest, most dramatic naval engagement ever fought by human beings. The first clash came in the Sibuyan Sea, where Kurita's center force, steaming toward San Bernardino Strait, was spotted by American submarines and then set upon by wave after wave of aircraft from Halsey's carriers. For hours, American dive bombers and torpedo planes swarmed the Japanese battleships like Hornets, and the great Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, became the primary target. She was a monster of steel, one of the most heavily armored warships ever built, designed to be virtually unsinkable. The American pilots did not believe that. Wave after wave, they put bombs and torpedoes into her hull, and Musashi kept absorbing the punishment, kept steaming, kept firing back with her massive anti-aircraft batteries. It took 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits, a staggering, almost unbelievable amount of damage before the great battleship finally capsized and sank beneath the waves, taking over 1,000 of her crew down with her. It remains one of the most extraordinary displays of a warship's ability to absorb punishment in the history of naval combat. Watching this devastation and believing his fleet could not survive further air attacks without air cover of its own, Kurita made a fateful decision. He turned his fleet around and retreated westward, appearing to abandon the attack entirely. Word of this reached Halsey, and combined with reports of Ozawa's decoy carrier force finally being spotted far to the north, Halsey made the decision that would define the entire battle and haunt naval historians for the next 80 years. He believed Kurita's force was crippled and retreating, no longer a threat. He believed the real prize, the Japanese carriers, lay to the north, ripe for destruction. And so, in one of the most controversial decisions of the Pacific War, Halsey took his entire Third Fleet, every battleship, every carrier, every escort, and sailed north to hunt Ozawa's decoys, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely undefended. He did not leave a single ship behind to guard it. The strait that Kurita's powerful battleship force needed to pass through to reach the vulnerable American landing beaches at Leyte was left wide open. While this was unfolding, far to the south, the Battle of Surigao Strait was reaching its climax, and it would become, in a strange and fitting way, the final chapter of an entire era of naval warfare. Admiral Nishimura's southern force steamed into the narrow strait in the dead of night, and American Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf was waiting for him with a battle line of 6 American battleships, several of which had been raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor after being sunk or damaged in the surprise attack nearly 3 years earlier. This was, in every sense, a battle of revenge. As Nishimura's ships entered the strait, American PT boats and destroyers struck first with torpedoes in the darkness, sinking or crippling several Japanese vessels before the main battle line even engaged. Then, in a maneuver naval officers had studied and dreamed of executing for a century, Oldendorf's battleships crossed the T of the Japanese formation, positioning his ships perpendicular to the enemy column, allowing every one of his guns to fire while the Japanese could only bring their forward guns to bear. Under a curtain of radar-guided 16-inch shellfire, Nishimura's flagship was sunk with the admiral aboard, and the Southern force was annihilated. This engagement, fought in the black of night in October of 1944, would go down in history as the last time in the story of naval warfare that battleships engaged each other in a ship-to-ship gun battle. An entire chapter of maritime combat, one that had defined naval power for centuries, closed forever in the waters of Surigao Strait. But it was what happened next, off the island of Samar, that would become the single most extraordinary episode of courage in the history of the United States Navy. With Halsey's powerful fleet chasing decoys hundreds of miles to the north, and Nishimura's force destroyed to the south, Kurita's center force, battered but still enormously powerful, with 4 battleships including the mighty Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, and a screen of destroyers emerged from San Bernardino Strait completely unopposed in the early hours of the morning and found, directly in its path, nothing but a handful of small, thin-skinned escort carriers and their tiny screen of destroyer escorts. This American force, known by the call sign Taffy 3, consisted of 6 escort carriers, ships built on merchant hull designs, slow, unarmored, carrying planes meant for supporting troops ashore, not fighting battleships, protected by only 3 destroyers and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts. Against them stood the most powerful surface battle fleet Japan had ever sent to sea, including the largest battleship ever built, whose main guns alone outweighed the entire displacement of some of the American ships facing them. What followed became known as the Battle off Samar, and it remains, to this day, one of the most astonishing acts of collective bravery in military history. Rather than surrender or flee into certain annihilation, the American destroyers and destroyers' escorts of Taffy 3 turned and charged directly at the Japanese battle fleet. Ships weighing barely 2,000 tons drove straight at battleships, weighing 70,000 tons, laying down smoke screens to hide their carriers, launching torpedo attacks at point-blank range under a storm of Japanese shellfire. The destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Ernest Evans, a Native American officer of Cherokee descent, led the charge, launching torpedoes that struck a Japanese heavy cruiser, then continuing to fight even after being hit repeatedly until finally, crippled and burning, she was surrounded and sunk, with survivors later reporting that Japanese sailors on a passing destroyer saluted the stricken American ship as she went down, a mark of respect for an act of almost unimaginable courage. The destroyer Hull and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts fought with the same suicidal ferocity, closing to point-blank range against battleships and cruisers, both eventually sunk, their crews fighting their guns until the ships slipped beneath the waves. Above the battle, the escort carrier's own aircraft, many of them unarmed or carrying only anti-submarine depth charges and machine guns rather than anti-ship weapons, made dummy attack runs and strafing passes simply to force the Japanese ships to take evasive action, buying precious minutes for the American carriers to escape. For nearly 2.5 hours, this desperate, one-sided battle raged, and remarkably, incredibly, the tiny American force held. Admiral Kurita, confused by the ferocity of the American resistance, uncertain of what other American forces might be lurking nearby, running low on fuel, and having lost track of the overall battle situation amid the smoke and chaos, made the decision to break off the attack and withdraw, turning his powerful battle fleet around and retreating back through San Bernardino Strait, abandoning what could have been a devastating, war-altering victory over the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. It was one of the most consequential decisions of the entire Pacific War, and to this day, historians still debate exactly why Kurita chose to retreat at the very moment total victory was within his grasp. It was also during this desperate battle off Samar that the world witnessed something entirely new and terrifying: the first organized kamikaze attacks of the war. Japanese pilots, understanding that conventional attacks could no longer stop the overwhelming might of American naval power, began deliberately crashing their bomb-laden aircraft directly into American ships, sacrificing their own lives in a final desperate attempt to inflict damage. The escort carrier Saint Lo was struck and sunk by one of these attacks, the first major warship in history lost to a deliberate suicide attack, and it signaled the beginning of a terrifying new phase of the Pacific War that would only intensify in the months to come. As kamikaze attacks became a defining and horrifying feature of the fighting at Okinawa and beyond. Far to the north, Halsey's powerful fleet finally caught up to Ozawa's decoy force and unleashed devastating airstrikes, sinking all 4 of the Japanese carriers involved, including the Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor nearly 3 years earlier. It was a genuine and significant victory, but it came at the cost of Halsey being lured entirely out of position, and only frantic, urgent radio messages from the escort carriers under attack off Samar, including one now legendary and blunt appeal for help, finally convinced Halsey to detach a portion of his battleship force and turn back south. Though by the time they arrived, Kurita's fleet had already withdrawn and the desperate battle had been decided by the courage of Taffy 3 alone. When the smoke cleared and the battle was finally over, the scale of what had happened became clear. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships including the mighty Musashi, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, along with thousands of experienced sailors and irreplaceable ships that Japan's shattered industrial base could never hope to replace. The United States had lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort, a fraction of the Japanese losses. But the numbers alone do not capture what truly happened at Leyte Gulf. This battle marked the effective end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force, capable of contesting control of the seas. Never again would Japan send a major fleet to sea to challenge American naval power directly. From this point forward, the war in the Pacific would be decided by air power, submarines, and the grinding, brutal island campaigns that would culminate at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Leyte Gulf also opened the door for MacArthur to make good on his promise, and within days of the naval battle's conclusion, American forces were pushing deeper into the Philippines, beginning the long, hard campaign to liberate the islands from Japanese occupation. But perhaps what makes the Battle of Leyte Gulf so unforgettable, drawn historians and naval enthusiasts back to study it for 8 decades, is not simply its staggering scale, the largest naval battle in human history by nearly every measure, more ships, more sailors, and more square miles of ocean than any naval engagement before or since. It is the human story woven through it. It is the image of the destroyer Johnston, a ship 1/30th the size of the battleship it faced, driving forward into point-blank range rather than turning away. It is the sailors of Taffy 3 aboard slow, unarmored escort carriers, launching planes with no weapons simply to buy time for their comrades. It is the extraordinary and still debated decision of a Japanese admiral who turned away from victory at the very last moment. And it is the closing of an entire era of warfare in the darkness of Surigao Strait, the final time in human history that battleships would ever fight one another gun to gun. A farewell to a 400-year-old tradition of naval combat that had shaped the modern world, extinguished forever in a single Pacific night. So now I want to ask you something. Knowing what you now know about the impossible courage of Taffy 3, about a few tiny American ships charging directly at the most powerful battleship ever built, Do you think Admiral Kurita made the right decision when he turned his fleet away from victory? Or do you believe, if he had pressed forward just a little longer, the entire outcome of the war in the Pacific could have changed? Write your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. And I would love to know what you think really happened in the mind of a commander, staring at annihilation and choosing to walk away from it. If this story moved you the way it moved me while researching it, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell so you never miss the next deep dive into the greatest battles in military history. And give this video a like if you believe stories like The Last Stand of Taffy 3 deserve to be remembered forever. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.